are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is the Corpsewood Manor murders. Now, with a name like that, everyone would expect a tragedy to occur, but did the victims themselves predict it? By the way, I am posting so much creepy, strange content like this for ODDtober this month, so do not miss out on it. Make sure you are subscribed with the post notification bell on, and if you want to make a girl happy, all you have to do is give this a thumbs up, leave a nice comment down below, and I will be absolutely so incredibly happy. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 1976 in Chicago, and Dr. Charles Scudder was working as a professor of pharmacology at the Loyola University of Chicago Institute for Mind, Drugs, and Behavior. And on his 50th birthday, he would actually leave his job because his father had just recently passed away and he had inherited some money. And with this good chunk of money, he decided that he wasn't just going to let it sit in his bank account, he was going to do something with it, and that is exactly what he did. Now, he had been married 2 times previously, divorced both times, but from those marriages had 4 children. But at this time in his life, the 4 children had grown up and moved out, and he was with his long-term partner named Joseph Odom. So the 2 of them and their 2 dogs decided to head out to a 40-acre piece of land that they had just bought with this money in Somerville, Georgia. Now, Charles and Joseph had met in a bookstore when Charles' children were still living at home, and he was kind of a single father to them, and they had immediately had a connection to the point where they were inseparable. Joseph moved in with Charles, and the children would help take care of the home and them. And Charles had so much respect for Joseph because Charles was more of the conventionally smart type of people, that he had so many different degrees and so many different things. He was more book smart. But he would say that Joseph was more of that street smart, getting a knowledge off of just living his life, and he truly respected him for that. And these 2 were truly had a connection that was just out of this world. And so at this point, when Charles was 50, they decided to head out to Somerville, Georgia together. They were going in a camper, and this is when they were driving their camper up to their home. On their driveway, when they came across a deceased horse. Now, they kind of made light of it and just decided to call the road Dead Horse Road and didn't think that, it was any bad juju or anything like that, and continued on. Now, when they pulled up to this 40-acre land, that's all it was, land. Now they needed to build a home, and they were going to do so by hand. They lived in their camper while they decided to use their own 2 hands to brick by brick build this house. And when they first got there was actually a horrible ice storm, which is what caused them to call this place Corpsewood, because all of the trees had died out around them. They had to wait a while to actually get started building this home. But in the end, it would be what they would call a fortress. It was a 2-story home that wasn't very secure, but it was definitely unique. They had a gargoyle out front, and they had also made several other buildings around this house, including a chicken coop, which on the first floor was completely padded with carpet and furniture and was known as the Pink Room, where they would have guests over. And it was also known to be a place where there were a lot of sexual activities going on. Charles had always been into strange things that some people didn't understand. I mean, he once had a pet monkey. He dyed his hair crazy colors, which now isn't too uncommon, but then was just crazy unique. And he would also tell people that he was a Satanist. He loved unique, like, antique decor that he put everywhere that most people didn't want anything to do with. And he was just one of the strangest men that someone could come across, but he was himself. This house took them actually a few years to finish, but when they were done, they had an on-site well, a chemical toilet, they had gardens, and they also put pentagrams everywhere, which, is the symbol for Satanism. And they were really into making it look like their home, not something that could be, sold and purchased again. There was no running water, phones, or electricity, meaning they were completely self-reliant, which is exactly how they wanted it. They kind of wanted this isolated piece of land where they could do everything themselves and didn't need anybody else. But because they had so much land, hunters would often ask to use it, and they would actually ask permission to be on their land and to use it to hunt. And Charles and Joseph were more than happy to let them do so, and they even had that pink room that they used as a guest room sometimes that they allowed them to stay in. They were very welcoming hosts and really approved of the company and enjoyed it. And there was actually 2 men that would come by often, and one was a 17-year-old named Kenneth Avery Brock, who went by Avery, and there was also Tony West, who was his 30-year-old roommate. Now, Avery was the one who had begun to go to the Corpsewood Manor first. He had found the place, and Charles and Joseph would often make homemade wine and talk to him, and Charles was kind of Avery's mentor, teaching him just everything about life that he didn't yet know, being such a young boy. Now, slowly, this mentorship turned into more of a relationship between Charles and Avery, and some even speculate Joseph was in on it too, and it was more of a sexual relationship. And so the 3 of them would spend a lot of time together, but now Avery was also bringing Tony, who was, like I said, his roommate, but who was also an ex-convict who had been charged with shooting his brother-in-law in the back after a poker game where he just got upset. It was now 1982, and Tony, of course, would be going with Avery. Tony would see Avery being involved with Charles and possibly Joseph in a sexual manner, and Tony was unfortunately not okay with this and didn't accept Avery for who he was. And because they were roommates, when Tony and Avery got home, Tony began to taunt him, saying that I didn't know you were gay, and basically making fun of him. And this really got to Avery to the point where he no longer wanted to identify as a gay or possibly bisexual man. I'm not really sure which one he identified as, but he didn't want to identify as either. He wanted to really shove down that part of himself and thought that it wasn't okay to be himself, which is the most heartbreaking part. But Tony really drilled it in him that it was not okay and that he should not be doing that. This caused Avery to despise Charles and Joseph, who he had once been so close with, and he began to tell Tony that he wanted to kill the queer devil worshippers, and that he wanted to rob them for all of the money that they supposedly had in this home. He thought that they were millionaires, and so with the idea of a murder and a robbery, Tony was instantly in. He loved anything to do with that. It would be easy for them too, because they were invited onto Corpsewood and would often get drunk with Charles and Joseph and have parties in this pink house, and Corpsewood was such a secluded place that it wouldn't be hard for nobody to hear anything. Then it was December 12th, 1982, and Avery and Tony were hanging out with 2 friends who were Joey Wells and his girlfriend Teresa Hutchins. And these 2, this couple, was wanting to go on a date. However, they didn't have a car that worked, so they couldn't really go anywhere, so they were kind of just stuck at home. And then they decided to go hang out with Avery and Tony, because everyone kind of lived in campers or trailers at this time near the Corpsewood house. So the 4 of them were hanging out together when they decided to go driving in Avery and Tony's car. They were also huffing Toodaloo, which is a combination of alcohol paint thinner and glue, and they were getting high off of this. They were kind of just messing around, trying to figure out where to go. And that is when Avery decided to say, maybe we should go to Corpsewood. We can party there, have some fun, we can hunt rabbits. And so the couple said, yeah, that sounds like fun, and they went to Avery's mother's house to pick up a .22 caliber rifle. When they arrived at Corpsewood, Charles was super friendly, like he always was. He gave them all homemade wine. They all sat around the pink room just talking and having fun, and that is when Avery would go outside after a few hours to make some more Toodaloo, except for that is not what he was doing at all. He would come back up the ladder that would enter into the pink room with the rifle in hand, and he would point it at Charles' head. Now, Charles, who thought that Avery was a friend of his and they had known each other so well, kind of took it as a joke and said, "Bang, bang," just thinking that he was joking around with him. And for a minute, Avery actually relaxed and put down the gun and kind of laughed with him, sat down and began to drink again. but this would not be the last time that Charles would have a gun in his face. Tony would get the hands on the rifle, and Avery would grab the knife out of his boot and put it at Charles' throat while Tony was pointing the gun at him. And at this point, they began to gag him with fabric from the pink room and tie his hands together and his feet together and interrogate him on where the money was. The couple that was with Tony and Avery, Teresa and Joey, ran down this ladder to the car that they had come in to only find that it wouldn't start and they were stuck there. Charles was doing the best he could to console this couple, especially Teresa, who was basically having a panic attack. And she was truly terrified, and even Charles, being at gunpoint and knife point, was trying to console her. The problem was, there was no money in this house, because all of the money had been spent to build the house. There was no money to give Avery and Tony. And then Avery would go into the house where Joseph was in the kitchen, and he would tell him to leave. However, when Joseph began to stand, that is when Avery would shoot him 4 times in the face. The 2 dogs who were sleeping nearby the fire, who were mastiffs, were also shot to death. And at this point, Tony was holding Charles at gunpoint with his own gun now in the pink room. Charles was then taken from the pink room to inside the house, where he saw Joseph and his 2 dogs deceased, and he began to moan and say incoherent words because he was still gagged, and you could tell that he was in just pure horror and sadness at this moment. And they sat him down on the couch and began to rummage through the house to look for this money. And at this point, Charles actually stood up and decided to walk towards Joseph, who was now lying on the floor in the hallway, and was just trying to be near him. And Tony looked over at him and said, "If you do that again, I'm going to shoot you." And so Charles stood up once again, walked towards Joseph, and was shot 5 times in the head, right after saying, "I asked for this." Avery and Tony grabbed everything they could that could be valuable in the house and drove off in Charles' car, which has that pentagram on it. It was very much identifiable. And the couple that was with Tony and Avery took the other car. This is where it gets kind of iffy. We're not exactly sure how Teresa and Joey got out of there. I mean, maybe they just simply just ran down the road, because that's what I would have done in that situation. But we're not exactly sure if they took another car, if they ended up getting Tony or Avery's truck started again, but they left as well, obviously. But it would take 2 days till the bodies of Charles and Joseph were found. And this was because a friend came by to tell them about a deceased relative who had just died. And when they pulled up, they noticed the door was open, there were bullet holes in the windows, and then they found them inside. Now, when the investigation started, of course, because Charles and Joseph were into strange things like dark artwork and satanic symbols, that's all anyone could focus on. But then they found a self-portrait that Charles had made where he was gagged and had 5 bullets to the head, which was exactly how he really died. So did he see his death? Did he have a premonition? This case gained huge media coverage, but only because these 2 men were gay, and they were also said to be devil worshippers. And so people really only talked about that. That was the only thing really reported on, and not their deaths. And they were even said to be horrible people who did horrible things that could only be seen in horror movies, and that they deserved to die. I mean, this is actual things that people were saying about murder victims. Investigators had no idea who had done this. However, they were about to have someone come forward, and that was Teresa Hutchins, who only wanted to go on a date with her boyfriend Joey that day, and ended up being involved in a double homicide. This woman told them everything, that she had gone with Avery and Tony to Corpsewood, and that they were the killers, and she literally told them anything they wanted to know, even though she was terrified because she had been threatened to be killed as well, because she wouldn't stop crying and they were afraid she was going to talk to police, which she ultimately did. But she did this knowing that there was a good chance that she would be killed if they weren't caught. And at the moment, nobody knew where Tony and Avery were. These killers were driving Charles' Jeep down the road, and unfortunately they were smart enough to change their car. So they stopped at Bonneville, Mississippi at a rest stop, and they came across a car that belonged to Navy Lieutenant Kirby Phelps, and they decided they were going to take his car. And Tony took him down to the woods where he was supposed to tie him to a tree, while Avery moved everything that they had taken from Corpsewood from Charles' Jeep to this new car when he heard 2 gunshots ring out. Tony had killed Kirby. Said to be because they killed another person, but for some reason these two actually ended up turning themselves in. Avery on December 20th and Tony on December 25th, so Christmas. But Tony would go in saying, "All I can say is they were devils and I killed them. That's how I feel about it." Tony and Avery's defense claimed that they were drugged with LSD from the owners of Corpsewood, so Charles and Joseph, and that their wine was laced with it, and that is why they ended up killing them. They were acting on the drugs and not in a right mind. However, according to the True Crime Guys podcast, LSD was found at Corpsewood. However, it was too old to actually be used. They were both ultimately found guilty, Avery getting life and Tony getting death, considering he had a criminal record previously. However, his death sentence was overturned on appeal, and Charles' body was cremated and sent back to Wisconsin to be buried on his family plot, where Joseph's was cremated and spread around Corpsewood. Now, why do you think Charles ended up saying, "I asked for this," right before his death? Was this because he had just moved there and he invited these people into his home? Was it that he was into darker things and kind of accepted the more darker fate? Or was it simply because he had stood up once again after Tony said that he would shoot him, and he was telling Tony, you know, "You didn't decide that I die"? I kind of lean more towards Charles being like, "You don't get to decide when you're going to kill me, and you're not going to get to torture me. I'm deciding right now that I'm going to stand up and you can take my life then," which he did. Now, if you believe in the paranormal, many say that Corpsewood, or the grounds that it stood on, is haunted to this day. A fire destroyed most of the building, but it's said that on the grounds you can hear dogs barking, you can hear gunshots, and you can hear a golden harp playing, which Charles loved to do. There's also a dark stain on one of the boards that panels up the library where Charles was shot, and it's said that possibly Charles is there kind of watching over his land. The home was then given to Charles' 4 sons, who have since sold it, but I just think that this case is heartbreaking in the fact that nobody cared that these 2 men were murdered. They only cared that they were gay and that they enjoyed these stranger things. Now, I know that, you know, some people can take the whole devil worshipping thing or Satanism to the next level, and it can be scary, and it can be something that is life-threatening to other people. However, it seemed to me, and according to the True Crime Guys podcast, they talked about it a lot, but it really was more of like a style that they were going for, like emo, like just a dark phase that they liked, just their style, rather than them actually, you know, having satanic rituals and stuff like that. They weren't harming anyone or any animals that I know of. I think they were just nice old men who had quirky personalities and didn't deserve any of this. And I did talk a few times about the True Crime Guys podcast, but I really recommend watching the whole thing. They had so much good information in there. I will leave it linked below, as I always do with any podcast that I use, but it's a great one, and they're really great at telling a story, so I really recommend that one. But I truly love to hear your theories on this one, because as soon as I got requested this case, I knew I had to do it for ODDtober. But don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay. Bye.